In the quiet stretch of Oakwood Lane, the air carried the sound of sprinklers ticking and children playing in driveways, but beneath the suburban calm lay secrets no one could see. Officer Mark Reynolds was a longtime resident of the street, a man in uniform whose presence was felt even when he wasn't around. He had worked for the local police department for nearly 2 decades, gaining a reputation for his strictness and a sharp tongue that often carried a sting of disdain toward the black residents he encountered on patrol. Neighbors described him as someone who watched too closely, a man who never seemed fully off duty, always lurking behind a gaze that felt more like surveillance than concern. To many, he was a figure to be avoided rather than admired. When Jasmine Carter moved into the small 2-bedroom house next door, she brought with her a fresh energy that quickly caught the attention of the community. At 23, Jasmine was young but ambitious, balancing long shifts as a nursing student with side jobs to cover her rent. Her smile lit up conversations with neighbors, and she carried herself with a warmth that made people feel at ease. For those who passed her in the street, she was the bright spot in a neighborhood that often felt rigid and reserved. Mark noticed her almost immediately. From his porch, he watched her unpack boxes, greet delivery drivers, and walk to her car with music playing softly from her phone. What started as curiosity turned into fixation. He told himself he was keeping an eye out for her safety, but deep down there was something more unsettling at work. His outward hostility toward people like Jasmine clashed with the growing pull he felt whenever she was nearby. It was a contradiction he refused to confront, choosing instead to rationalize his behavior as natural interest. As the days turned into weeks, Mark's routine began to shift. He lingered outside more often, finding reasons to be in his yard when Jasmine returned home. He noticed the small details about her life, the time she left for work, the color of her scrubs, the way she laughed on the phone with friends. Each observation deepened his sense of control, even though Jasmine remained unaware of the intensity of his gaze. Other neighbors saw the attention, though they dismissed it as nosy curiosity, something Mark was known for. He had always been the type to monitor the street, writing down license plates of unfamiliar cars or questioning teenagers who stayed out past dark. But with Jasmine, the attention seemed different. It was quieter, more calculated, as though he was studying her every move. Jasmine, focused on her studies and new independence, carried on without noticing the danger forming next door. To her, Mark was simply the middle-aged cop who lived alone after his wife had grown distant. She waved politely when their paths crossed, not realizing that every small interaction was feeding an obsession. What to her was neighborly courtesy was to him the opening of a door he believed was meant to be walked through. Behind the closed blinds of his home, Mark replayed these moments in his mind, convincing himself that Jasmine's kindness was something more. In a neighborhood built on silence and routine, a dangerous story had already begun to write itself, hidden in the spaces between their houses, waiting for the moment when secrecy would spill into the open. What began as Mark's silent fixation soon crept into Jasmine's life in ways she hadn't expected. At first, it was harmless enough. Offers to carry her groceries, small talk over the fence, a steady presence that seemed protective rather than intrusive. Mark knew how to wear charm when he wanted to. He had spent years presenting himself as a dependable officer, the kind of man who commanded authority, but could also soften his tone when it served him. For Jasmine, his attention was unexpected, even flattering. She was still adjusting to the loneliness of living on her own, balancing school and work without family nearby. A neighbor who showed interest felt like a small comfort, a reminder that someone was watching out for her. But as the days grew longer, those casual encounters slipped into something more complicated. Mark began appearing at her door under the pretense of checking on her safety. He warned her about crime in the area, about break-ins that hadn't actually happened, about the dangers of walking alone at night. Slowly, he painted himself as her shield against a world he exaggerated as threatening. His uniform gave weight to his words, and Jasmine, though uncertain, felt a strange mix of reassurance and unease. The first time they met outside the neighborhood, it was Mark who suggested it. He framed it as a casual outing, a chance to unwind after a long week. Jasmine hesitated, aware of the unspoken gap between their lives, his age, his position, his reputation, but curiosity and his persistence pushed her toward a reluctant yes. That meeting turned into another, and soon a secret pattern emerged. They found places far from Oakwood Lane where no one would recognize them. Restaurants out of town, quiet motels, empty parking lots. To Mark, each encounter was proof that Jasmine belonged to him. Jasmine told herself it was temporary, something she could control. But she soon realized Mark was different from anyone she had known. His interest wasn't soft or playful, it was intense, almost suffocating. He wanted to know where she was at all times, what she was doing, and who she was speaking to. When she didn't respond quickly to his messages, he grew restless, showing up unannounced with a smile that never quite hid his suspicion. The secrecy weighed heavily on her. She understood the risk if anyone found out, especially given his standing in the community. She also felt the tension of his hypocrisy. Here was a man who, in public, carried the same prejudice he privately ignored to be with her. The contradiction unsettled her, but Mark dismissed her concerns with ease, insisting that no one would ever find out. Neighbors began noticing his late-night absences, the quiet hours when his car was gone from the driveway. His wife, long aware of cracks in their marriage, started asking questions. But Mark felt untouchable, convinced his badge and authority could cover the shadows he created. For Jasmine, the affair no longer felt like a choice she had made, but a trap she had stepped into unknowingly. What she thought was fleeting had become something she couldn't easily escape. Every secret meeting deepened Mark's grip. What had started as neighborly charm was now control disguised as protection, and Jasmine was left questioning whether she had stumbled into the arms of a man she could trust or a danger that would one day consume her. Mark's carefully built facade began to unravel in ways he hadn't prepared for. For years, he had maintained two sides of himself: the stern officer who demanded respect and the man who secretly fed his prejudices behind closed doors. But the longer he entangled himself with Jasmine, the harder it became to keep the two versions separate. His obsession with her was no longer something he could conceal with a controlled smile or a quick excuse. It started seeping into his work, his marriage, and the image of authority he had always clung to. On the job, colleagues noticed a change in him. He was restless, short-tempered, and distracted during patrols. Reports that once bore his sharp handwriting now showed rushed scrawls. When speaking with residents, his hostility flared without warning. Minor confrontations escalated quickly, and his behavior earned whispers within the department. Some saw it as stress, others as arrogance, but no one guessed the real reason. Mark's mind was no longer in his badge. It was across the street, trapped in the orbit of a young woman who had unknowingly become the center of his world. At home, his wife's suspicion deepened. She had long sensed distance between them, but now the late-night drives, the unexplained absences, and the smell of perfume that wasn't hers made the truth harder to ignore. Arguments became routine, sharp words thrown across the dinner table, followed by silence that lingered until morning. Mark grew paranoid, convinced that any wrong glance from a neighbor or stray question from his wife meant that someone had discovered his secret. He tightened his control over Jasmine in response, demanding more of her time, questioning her choices, and feeding off the fear that she might end things before he was ready. Meanwhile, Jasmine felt the walls closing in. What she once thought was a relationship she could quietly step away from had transformed into something volatile. She tried to create distance, limiting their meetings and avoiding his late-night calls. But Mark noticed every change, every shift in tone, every unanswered text. His jealousy grew sharper by the day. When Jasmine posted a photo of herself smiling with a friend on social media, it sent him into a spiral. The picture itself was harmless, but in Mark's mind it was evidence of betrayal, a public display of disloyalty that humiliated him. He replayed the image over and over, his anger mounting with each glance. The whispers in the neighborhood only fueled his paranoia. Neighbors had begun talking, questioning why Mark's patrol car was parked near Jasmine's home at odd hours. Some speculated he was checking on her safety, but others saw through the excuses. The more the gossip spread, the more desperate Mark became to control the narrative. His obsession was no longer just about keeping Jasmine, it was about preserving the illusion of power he had spent his life building. The cracks in his mask grew deeper each day. For Jasmine, the affair had shifted from a dangerous secret to a looming threat she couldn't escape. And for Mark, the pressure of holding his double life together pushed him closer to the edge, where obsession and rage would soon collide in a way neither of them could take back. The summer night carried a heavy stillness, the kind that pressed down on the neighborhood until even the crickets seemed reluctant to sing. Jasmine returned home from her evening shift. tired but relieved to step into her quiet space. She had been pulling away from Mark for weeks, carefully trying to reclaim her independence, but the tension was beginning to consume her. She sensed his presence everywhere, his car idling at the corner, the shadow of his figure lingering too long outside, the unanswered knocks that came late at night. That evening, she locked her doors more tightly than usual, unaware that her efforts would not be enough to keep him out. Mark had been watching her for hours, pacing in the darkness of his living room with thoughts that twisted tighter the longer he stared at her house. The photograph on social media still burned in his mind, a reminder of her laughter with someone else, a reminder that she was slipping away from him. His fury was not a sudden spark. It was a storm that had been building for months. By the time he walked across the lawn toward her home, his decision had already hardened into something irreversible. Inside, Jasmine noticed the sound of footsteps too late. The knock was forceful, demanding, carrying the weight of authority she no longer trusted. Fear rushed through her, but before she could gather her thoughts, the door opened to reveal the man she had once considered a protector. His face was a mask of anger, his eyes bloodshot, his movements unsteady. What followed was a confrontation that escalated with terrifying speed. The argument was not about love, nor even betrayal. It was about control. Mark's words were laced with accusations, his hands trembling as he gestured wildly, his voice echoing through the small house. Jasmine tried to calm him, tried to explain, but every attempt only sharpened his rage. In his mind, her independence was rebellion, and rebellion could not be tolerated. The struggle that broke out was sudden and violent, filling the quiet house with the sounds of chaos, furniture overturned, glass shattering, desperate attempts to fight back against a man who would not let go. When the silence finally returned, it was a silence far heavier than the one that had blanketed the neighborhood hours earlier. Jasmine lay motionless on the living room floor, her life cut short in the very place she had hoped to build her future. Mark stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands stained with the irreversible weight of what he had done. For a moment, reality threatened to break through his fury, but rather than accept it, he scrambled to cover his tracks. Panic drove his next moves. He staged the scene clumsily, scattering items to make it look like a break-in. Drawers were left open, belongings tossed carelessly across the floor, but the details betrayed his inexperience. The blood told a different story. The prints on the walls marked his presence, and the signs of struggle revealed far more than he realized. He believed his badge would shield him, that his reputation could create doubt. But the evidence was already betraying him. By dawn, flashing lights illuminated Oakwood Lane. Police cars lined the street, neighbors gathered in shock, and whispers filled the air as Jasmine's home became the center of tragedy. The story Mark thought he could control was no longer his to hide. The deadly night had shattered not only Jasmine's future, but the fragile mask he had worn for years, leaving behind a crime too brutal to be buried in silence. The investigation began before the sun fully rose. As detectives combed through Jasmine's small home, piecing together the fragments of the deadly night, the crime scene told a story that no amount of staging could erase. The overturned furniture, the blood spatter, and the clear signs of a struggle painted a picture of violence that could not be mistaken for a random break-in. Mark's fingerprints were everywhere, on the doorknob, on the shattered glass, even on Jasmine's phone, which he had tried and failed to hide. The narrative he had crafted collapsed under the weight of the evidence within hours. Word spread quickly across Oakwood Lane. Neighbors who had once only whispered now spoke freely to investigators, their suspicions spilling into the open. Several admitted to seeing Mark's car parked outside Jasmine's house on countless nights. One neighbor recalled hearing muffled arguments through the walls. Another described the strange way Mark lingered near Jasmine's front porch, even when she wasn't home. What had been ignored as nosy behavior was now understood as something much darker. The secrecy of his affair with Jasmine was unraveling, thread by thread, before the eyes of the community. Jasmine's friends came forward with messages and confessions of her fears. She had told them about his controlling nature, his unpredictable moods, and her growing sense that she had trapped herself in something she could not escape. Screenshots of his texts revealed his obsession in stark detail, dozens of unanswered messages, angry demands for her time, and veiled threats hidden under the guise of concern. The digital trail destroyed any hope Mark had of convincing others that Jasmine's death had been anything other than intentional. In the courtroom, the weight of his hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. The prosecutor laid bare the double life of Officer Mark Reynolds, a man who publicly wore his racism like armor, yet privately pursued the very person he claimed to despise. The irony was not lost on the jury, nor was the cruelty of his actions. Witness after witness described the way he watched Jasmine, the way his presence loomed over her life, the way she slowly pulled away as his grip tightened. The evidence left no room for doubt. His defense crumbled. The badge that had once shielded him now made the betrayal more severe. He had sworn to protect, but instead, he had hunted. The community that once avoided him now sat in judgment, listening to the chilling details of how his obsession turned to violence. Every testimony pulled him further from the man he had pretended to be and closer to the truth of what he was, a predator cloaked in authority. The verdict was swift and final. Guilty on all charges. The sentence ensured that Mark Reynolds would never walk Oakwood Lane again. For the neighbors, it was both justice and tragedy. Justice for Jasmine, whose life had been stolen at the threshold of her future. Tragedy in the realization that the danger had always been next door, hiding behind the thin veil of respectability. Even after the trial, the street carried the weight of the story. Jasmine's house stood as a quiet memorial, flowers left on the porch by friends and strangers alike. For those who lived nearby, every glance toward the empty home was a reminder of the violence that had shattered their illusion of safety. The name of Mark Reynolds would forever be spoken with disdain, not as the officer who patrolled their streets, but as the man who let hatred, obsession, and secrecy destroy everything around him.